Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Naomi Inglar. I'm the Communications and Training Coordinator for the Tulane Center of Excellence in Maternal Child Health and the Tulane Prevention Research Center. Today is our third and final seminar in the Spring 2018 series of our Health, Racism, and Communication seminar series. If you haven't already, please do sign in and take an evaluation sheet outside. This helps us not only report to our funders the work that we're doing, but it also helps us know are we meeting what you are wanting in these seminars. So please do fill out the evaluations and let us know if you have any ideas on future speakers or ways that we can improve these seminars. I definitely want to thank the other student groups who are co-sponsoring today's seminar as well as the series this semester. So that is Tulane Society for Young Black Public Health Professionals, Tulane African Student Association, Salute for Latin American Communities, and the Tulane Society for Sexuality, Health, and Gender. Without them, we wouldn't be able to provide you with this wonderful meal. So Bejan from TASA is going to come and speak about our speaker, or introduce our speaker today. A reminder that we do need to clear the room before 1 o'clock because the class is coming in at 1 o'clock, so please let's all be respectful of that. Also, last but not least, if you're on social media, feel free to live tweet with us, hashtag Tulane PRC Seminar, as well as hashtag Wilborn Clinical Services.
Hi everyone, my name is Bejan. I'm a second year MPH studying maternal child health. I am the president of TASA, and I will be introducing our speaker today, Dr. Tammy Wilborn. Dr. Tammy Wilborn is a licensed professional counselor, board-approved clinical supervisor, and a national certified counselor. She is a visiting assistant professor of counseling at the University of New Orleans and the owner and chief clinical officer of Wilborn Clinical Services, a private practice based in New Orleans that offers counseling, clinical supervision, teaming, education, and consultation. Dr. Wilborn is the founder of the annual Black Women's Wellness Conference, a wellness conference that was founded to promote mental health and well-being in Black women. She has almost 20 years of experience as a professional counselor with a specialty in child and adolescent trauma. Dr. Wilborn regularly presents at national, regional, state, and local professional conferences and currently serves as the president-elect of the Louisiana Association of Counselor Education and Supervision. She is also a member of both the American Counseling Association and the Louisiana Counseling Association. Please help me welcome Dr. Tammy Wilborn. So, thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to be with you all again. Actually, my first time here was as an attendee. There was another seminar, I can't remember the exact name, but I recognize one of the presenters presented information on research and data and how best to communicate that. And so I'm happy to be back here with you on this side. So before we get started, I always just kind of like to know who's in the room. So raise your hand if you're a student. And what about if you are faculty? And then what about others? And students. Just call out really quick. I'm going to take for granted that most of you are public health students. Anybody not a public health student? Social work? Okay. Who else? Anybody else? So I have mostly public health and social work students. Faculty, what programs are you with? Faculty being shy? No. I'm in epidemiology. Okay. And then we have others, right? So, others, where are you? Where are you in terms of programming or position? Just really quick, I know you're very comfortable discussing that. It feels fun to be other, doesn't it? Othering is nice, isn't it? No. Not exactly. Because when you're other, you don't particularly have, there's sort of dismissal of your identity, your membership, your position, your place, right? So keep that in mind in terms of the impact of being other people, what otherness does in terms of exclusion. And all of that. So I think it's always important, particularly as someone who identifies as a qualitative researcher, to sort of situate myself in this space and to bring a perspective of who's in front of you. So thank you so much for the person who introduced me and all that nice, fun stuff, and certainly who I am and some of the things that I do. But I think there's some other layers to who I am and what I do that I think is also critical. I think to understanding the perspective that I'm going to today. So in terms of personal identity, I identify strongly as a Black female. I don't think that's a surprise in terms of presentation. I assume you probably picked that up, that's maybe how I identify. Hey, I also personally identify with being from New Orleans, born, raised, and returned. And particularly the returning part has value because I'm back to do some of what I'm doing today, which is to share information, to make connections, to serve my community. When I left in 2003, I was more focused on what New Orleans did not provide. And here we are in 2018, and my focus is on what can I provide to my city that I love so much. So that's the perspective. I think what's also important to understand is while I get to experience a somewhat middle class life as an academic and as a professional, my roots are really working class. You know, my mother was a single female who was female of three. I was the oldest. My grandmother was the help, and as a young person, I would often travel with her to clean houses in affluent parts of the city. And so there's a perspective that I have that I think is sort of broad insofar as having working class underpinnings and also being positioned where I am now. There's a professional identity that is also with me today. As a professional counselor, there are certain, as a professional counselor, as a counselor educator, as a clinical supervisor, as someone who researches in counseling literature, there are certain professional values that our profession holds dear and that serve as frameworks for what we do. So the ideas and values are related to autonomy and non-reluctance and beneficence and veracity are things that really provide a foundation for what I do. But also in counseling, social justice advocacy and multicultural competency is embedded in all the work that we do. And so for us, situating culture is not something that's just ancillary, but is necessary. This is what we do as counselors. And so that is the perspective that I bring here. I think the last thing that's important to understand is from a researcher standpoint, I situate myself as an early career researcher. So I completed my doctoral studies in 2015 at UNC Charlotte. And my research was a phenomenological study examining the experiences of low-income Black women with race and gender stereotypes at work. And so I will reference that study as I go throughout this presentation today. So we're going to start with, I like to do things a little experientially, so we're going to have a mindful slideshow, and then there's going to be a self-assessment that you all will get to take later on. But I want to give you some brief instructions. So you all will
watch. I should probably have also situated myself as someone who is not technologically savvy. So if I fumble through this, I have situated myself there and you understand. And also the fact that you'll laugh at my jokes, let me know that you're my people and I am in good company. So we are okay. So I want you to focus on the images that will show up in this slideshow. And I want you to pay attention to your reactions to these images, the thoughts that come up for you, those initial thoughts and reactions that come up for you. And as you sit with those images, I want you to think about and pay attention to perhaps maybe how your perspective of the person or the individual that represents groups, how that might change or may have changed as you spend some time looking and taking in the image. Does that make sense? Okay. And then afterwards, you all are going to, for a few minutes, pair up and talk a little bit about what your experiences were related to this particular activity. And then we'll have some larger group discussion around that. Can we agree to do that? All right. And then I'll be sure to loop it back around just so that you can maybe process it once more. Does anybody need for me to loop that once more? No? Okay. So what I want you to do is to spend maybe about 5 minutes or so in a pair, noting those images that stood out for you. And some discussion about why. Part of the way that this process works is that we have to trust that we are going to engage in the conversation that's respectful of values and differences, and also that we can be honest with each other. Okay, so let's I hope we can agree that we can be honest and be truthful in how we are responding to some of these images. So, Tara, it's been a few minutes talked about those reactions. Yeah, about 3 more minutes.
to be happy that you all are having conversations, like rich conversations about images in a slideshow.
So I'm curious to know, from whoever wants to share, what did you notice about your initial reaction to some of the images? Who can speak to share with that? Oh, I can't. Tell me your name. Amanda.
I noticed I had two reactions. I had my initial reaction and then I had my wait, but that reaction. So I noticed it was this quick reaction as it like reflected what I've been taught or like growing up knowing. And then my second reaction was based upon what I've learned, what I like personally developed in my personal beliefs.
Yes. So what Amanda shared is that there was this sort of initial reaction that popped into her head about specific images. But then there was sort of I would imagine that she sat with that image more, then there was also a reaction that reflected the person that she is now in terms of education and experience, so on and so forth. Did I add too much to that?
No,
Okay. I tend to do that at times. That's the counselor reframing.
yeah.
Yes, I so you're not Courtney. I did not actually, but I have a lot of that was I knew what we were looking at photos for because of the hard field of that I come at it with that perspective a lot, which is hopefully good, but then there's some of them that stand out and how touching support, even though I'm coming at it from like a processing point where I'm trying to step back and make a reaction. That some of those photos are powerful enough to make a reaction. And so like understanding that no matter how hard I try
Yeah, to me, it sort of feels off what Amanda said, that regardless of your education and the process of being reflected, that there are some images that you're still going to have an automatic reaction to, right? That regardless, no matter how much you work at it, there is that initial reaction. Yes. Other thoughts? Yes.
There's some images that you get an automatic sense of language, and it's instantaneous, and there's no reflection upon it. Your whole picture is like one reflects and then under there's no perfect on top of it, but then on that, elimination is not justify, not to judge. Sure. But when you see a woman there, and there's no reconciliation, reflection. Like something is this, or something reconciliation.
Yeah, that there's, for some of these images, it engenders empathy in us easily. We don't have to think a whole lot about it. And that reflects maybe personal values about maybe what that image represents or what that image represents. And we don't have to think about it. We see it and we go, we immediately feel empathy, right? A sense of concern or need to maybe want to understand or explain. Yes.
Especially the image of the person and their mindset class system, that image made me realize how quickly I label people's genders, like automatically. When I see them and it had this preferred picture, that was an automatic reaction until I saw that picture. And so we were talking about that as a really automatic process. And really, sometimes we see something that doesn't fit into a very narrow presentation of what the gender is supposed to look like. And slow that process down a little bit and allow to create more space.
Yes, I think that's important in terms of the automatic sort of labeling and categorizing, stereotyping that we sort of do. And that we really have to be mindful and intentional about creating space to maybe think about, does this really reflect who this person is or maybe what is going on? Or is there another explanation or way of understanding or seeing this person? Any other final reaction that you want to share. Why is this important for the work that you all do? Public health professional, social work, yes.
My name is Tyler, and it's important for us to kind of realize what our personal biases are. So a lot of that is like reflected in how our initial thoughts when we see these pictures, kind of like what you're thinking, like what your underlying thoughts are, not necessarily that you feel that way all the time. First, like she was saying, your second thought will come to you like, okay, I've learned about this, and I know that I should, I guess, think a certain type of way. But it kind of highlights that. I noticed that when I was like looking at some pictures, and my first thought was kind of like, when I went back to it, I was like, maybe I shouldn't really think that way all bad about something, but
Yeah, that's who we are, what we're taught, the values that we learned, those things are still with us. Education, experience notwithstanding. The education we experiences teach us to be mindful and to spend the time processing and being reflective. But the human side of us has this tendency to label and categorize, and so we still have to, even though with all of our good education and experiences, still be very intentional about seeing people as human and representing our spectrum and not the way we were taught to see certain individuals. Yes, and you're a Tyler, right?
That was Kiara, but that was recent. I was basically gonna say that.
And you can say more if you want to. You don't have to. Voice is important. It was too good. Gotcha. Go ahead. Tell me your name.
My name's Alex.
Alex.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that by saying that a big way that shows up in the public health world is in research, especially in the academic setting. Just in terms of like what someone's like underlying assumptions are about why a problem might be occurring in a given population, and even just the way that the results are framed and the way that preliminary findings are framed really matters and can perpetuate some of these concerns.
Absolutely, in terms of how we report the data, we will talk a little bit about even how the data is disseminated, and what, all of that is reflective of our values, and as much as we try to, of course, bring rigor to our scientific project, we still walk into those experiences with these values and biases, and they need to be, we need to be mindful of working through to make sure that we're, presenting a critical eye to the data. Covering, yes. R. Can you project? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think the thing that was really significant in terms of what you said is listening and making sure that we are reflective. I'll take your last call and then we'll move to the presentation.
I would consider
Tell me your name.
Anna. In assessing whether a program or an intervention is successful or not, that we're going to like remind the community and not our bias, which is really like it's purely program.
Sure, but finding a way to connect the work that we do to the community that we are serving, or maybe to the community that represents the folks that we're studying, right? So in terms of objectives, we're going to talk a little bit about, we did some of this in terms of the mindfulness show. We'll talk a little bit about bias in research and practice work. Certainly learn to describe the impact of personal bias and how that shows up in research in our practice. And also try to attempt to define culturally responsive research practices. So just in terms of a general understanding of maybe why we'd want to have this culturally responsive sort of research is that we have a diverse country, at least for now. We hope it stays that way, right? Diversity matters. So in terms of United States, we see that in terms of racial and ethnic categories, Latino and Hispanic populations make up 17.8% of the population, Blacks or African Americans 13%, Asian in communities make up 5.7%, and then American Indian and Alaskan Native 1.3%. And so then when we break that down to Louisiana, you have 32% Blacks represented, Latino 5%, Asian 1.8%, and American Indian and Alaskan Native 0.8%. And then when we funnel it down even further, we get to New Orleans and we have Blacks representing about 60% of the population, Latino 5.5%, Asians 2.9%, and American Indian and Alaskan Natives 0.2%. And we expect those numbers to continue to grow. So just in terms of population, we have a diverse population, and the research and the practices that we engage in need to reflect an understanding that our society is diverse, and that there's diverse experiences within. So, go here. So, in terms of just understanding culture, I want us to sort of be oriented to this definition of culture as a system of shared beliefs, values, taboos, customs, behaviors, artistic products that a group of people transmit from generation to generation, and that members of the group use to understand their world and each other. And the thing that's, I think, important to understand is that we are all cultural beings. We all possess culture and represent different cultural identities. So in terms of trying to define culturally responsive research, I define it as culturally responsive research is defined as a process where researchers acknowledge the existence of, show interest in, demonstrate knowledge of, and express appreciation for participants' ethnicity and culture, and include culture throughout the research process. So it's not something that's happening at one point in time, but it's happening from the beginning of the process when you're conceiving your research problem, all the way to how those data get disseminated. So in terms of understanding, again, this sort of need for culturally responsive research, there's a history, particularly in our country, of racism and bias and unethical practices in research that suggests that we take certain steps to make sure that we include and understand cultural context and how they impact the folks that we are studying, right, as participants in the types of research projects we engage in. And so from a researcher perspective, we see bias in terms of value differences. Can anybody give me an example of how that might show up in terms of a researcher having a value difference from his or her participants? What might that look like? Yes.
PR, right? Yes. Someone that's doing like research on spanking, and they view as like something really bad and super bad. So there are people that the culture or the people that they interview who do spank, they might already have something against it, saying like, oh, you're doing this bad, you may be a bad parent spank, without really understanding the history of their culture or the reasoning.
Yes, I think that's a great example. We were actually talking about that in one of our classes this week about values about spanking and how for some it's seen as punishment and corporal punishment, and for others it's seen as an appropriate discipline practice. Any other example? Yes.
Batty.
Someone doing research on family planning practices, but maybe, yes, for example.
Absolutely. Yes. Another way that we see Bias show up as in language barriers and language differences, right? So researchers that are engaging in research who are not linguistically competent and are not making sure to, throughout the process, engage in linguistically competent practices or engaging with gatekeepers or effective use of translators and such to make sure that the data is reliable and valid. Stereotypic views about certain groups, right? We did some of that processing today where we didn't necessarily label our stereotypes, but some of the reactions that we had to the images reflected our stereotypes or our bias about those images or the individuals that represented particular group membership. We also see bias show up in not understanding our own culture. One of the things that we all like to sort of talk about and bounce around is this idea of privilege, right? And we tend to sort of ascribe privilege to certain people, but we all have it. We all have privilege, right? As a person who is physically able-bodied, I have privilege. I can take for granted that most places that I navigate, I can navigate with ease. I don't have to think about it. It's just there, right? But if I don't realize the privilege that I have, or you don't realize the privilege that you have, we can miss opportunities to connect with our participants, and we can also miss how we might be stereotyping, judging, oppressing, whatever that comes from privilege. Does that make sense? So understanding our own culture, our own values, our own beliefs, where they come from, why they're there, can also be a barrier that promotes or encourages bias. Another way that we see bias is not understanding participants' worldview and environment. Can anybody think of an example of how that might look in your field? Whether it's research or practice? Yes. Is it Amanda?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe like some men thinking that like women are just whining or like worrying about abortion when they talk about like micro sexism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Definitely.
A lot of trauma informed work and what we do about finances and learning to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Trauma is huge, right? Trauma is so pervasive, and oftentimes when we talk about, when I'm thinking about some of the young people that I work with that have had issues in school with behavior and academic performance, we tend to talk about little Johnny as little Johnny being bad, instead of understanding the bad thing that happened to little Johnny, right? We don't think about that. And so when we don't understand trauma as a type of experience in culture, we can misdiagnose, under-recognize, under-report, fail to assess or help those individuals who might be impacted by that particular cultural preference. Yes.
So when we talk about faith planning, still like not understanding that like we have this culture that we have like 2 or 3 children here, but in other countries the more values based on having more than 5.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Also, in terms of researcher bias, pathologizing behaviors that don't conform to norms. So some of what we talked about a little bit already represents that. Other reasons for why we might want to engage in culturally responsive practice is because in terms of research, we have history of unethical practices in research, right? And so most of you are familiar with the Tuskegee study, have heard of that, right? Significant issue of not informing participants of the nature of the study or access to treatment, costs the government a lot of money and a lot of issues there. So we have history with particular groups that experience unfair practices, unethical practices who were research participants. And then there are also traditional sort of research designs that have at times silenced or ignored the experiences of marginalized groups. So one way that we can perhaps promote culturally responsive research is through the use of specific types of research frameworks, right? And qualitative research is one of those. And so qualitative frameworks are useful for highlighting the voices and experiences of underrepresented and marginalized groups that have mostly been absent from traditional research designs. Qualitative research and frameworks are critical because it centers culture and it centers social context as, again, necessary to understanding the experiences of the participants. And participants then are seen as sort of co-researchers in terms of constructing the problem, in terms of addressing specific problems that are under study. And then in terms of the researchers, the researcher is seen as an instrument insofar as the interactions and the relationship that the researchers are forming with participants or with gatekeepers. We'll talk a little bit about gatekeepers in a minute. And what's important about particularly this framework is that as a researcher, your experience is critical to understanding the problem and the data and how it gets reported. But it's also critical that you bracket your experience, right? And so that you are making sure that you bracket your experiences to bring more critical eye to the data. Let me pause. Is this making sense? Okay, I want to make sure I haven't left anybody. So we're going to pause right here. I don't know who's helping me out with this. What's going around is an assessment tool. While that's going around, I'm going to talk about this slide. I want you to take a few minutes to answer the questions here, but while they're passing it out, a lot of times when we're talking about research, or we're talking about practice, or we're talking about the work that we do, we tend to spend a lot of time talking about them, right? Those people. And I think the thing that's important to understand when you're trying to promote culturally responsive research is that it's important for you to be aware of you and the values that you bring and the biases that you come with. And so it's not about talking about them, because I think it's important to understand that we are all them to somebody else, right? We're all them to somebody else. And so one of the foundational ideas in terms of cultural responsiveness is you having an awareness of yourself as a researcher. So I want you to take a few minutes to answer these questions. I see people looking around for pens and writing instruments. Take a few minutes. You don't have to share the results, but I want you to go through this assessment of yourself as a multicultural being, or a cultural being. Of course, I know you're finished when you look up. bottom, it sort of talks about you reflecting on your responses as it relates to the classroom. But if you're not in the classroom and you're in a work capacity, reflect on it as it relates to your work experience. The hope is that you're answering honestly with yourself. We tend to do that social desirability thing, don't we? We answer how we think the person wants us to be seen, or how we think they want us to do that, but the person usually will. I will not collectively look at it. One more minute or so. So what do you think? And of course, share your comfort. What did you learn about yourself as a result of this assessment in terms of your multicultural awareness? Yes, there's some room for improvement. Yes.
I realized I put a lot of effort into trying to, like, the ones that I put fives are almost always like, I recognize who the influence, or I am attentive, or I make a conscious effort. So it's all about the try part. I may not like have it all together, but I'm trying.
So there's a recognition that you're aware and are trying to do these things. Yes. To do some of these things. Yes. Other thoughts? There's a sense of awareness. There's a need for continued growth. Anybody else want to share? Yes.
I noticed that when my answers, especially, I listened with interest to those that differ from mine. My answer to that question would have been different 3 years ago in a different political climate. And so I recognized the external influences on my life.
Yes. So you recognize that how you responded reflects the current moment that you're in socially and politically. Absolutely. Yes. And I think that's instructive to consider. Yes.
Similarly, that
was my lowest score, like wanting to listen to people who I did differ from mine. But I was also kind of of two minds of like, am I likely to do this in a work situation, like when I put on my social worker hat, versus like in my day-to-day life, am I willing to do that? Because I feel like sometimes the profession, or like the part of me that aspires to be a good professional, is like more compassionate and more open than I am in my day-to-day life.
Sometimes that's true. Yeah, but there's this recognition that there are certain contexts that seem more easy for you to do that, and that it's not always sort of transferable across contexts. Maybe from the growth. I don't know. But how you respond and why you responded, I think, reflects the things that have certainly been said and certainly those things that haven't been said, right? And so I think the thing that's important to understand is this is an ongoing process, this sense of self-awareness, this sense of things need to still be worked on. There is no multicultural or cultural competence certificate that you get, right? This process is ongoing. And so I think that's probably one of the things to be to really walk away from that experience. It's ongoing, context matters, and we don't always get it right. So in terms of being aware as a researcher, in terms of attitudes and beliefs, it's important for you to be aware of what types of assumptions are you bringing into your research projects and where those assumptions come from, right? So some of those assumptions can be because of the things that you learn. You know, family messages are important in terms of shaping our worldview about ourselves and other people. And of course, education and experience helps us to kind of refine that and maybe to sometimes deconstruct and then reconstruct understanding in the way that's empathic, but it's still with us. So what assumptions are you bringing in? What stereotypes do you have about certain individuals who represent group membership? Why does that exist? Where does that come from? Or bias, or specific discomfort that you have with groups. And so it's really important for you to be clear, or at least understand the kinds of beliefs and values that you're walking into your research project with. The other thing that's important to be aware of is knowledge, right? And specifically knowledge of your own cultural heritage, your own cultural identity, which again comes from understanding the assumptions and stereotypes and values that you particularly have, understanding how power, privilege, and oppression works in your own self. I mentioned earlier that we all have privilege, and I think we don't always think about privilege in that way. We tend to ascribe that to certain people, but we all have it. And so how does privilege operate in your life, power operate in your life, and how are you using that to liberate and or oppress? And then in terms of skills, engaging in reflective or reflexive skills to reflect how your values and beliefs could shape your research, engaging in educational and training experience, kind of like what we're doing today, to improve your understanding of how these beliefs and values play into the work that you're doing, bracketing your experience. So y'all know what I mean when I say bracketing? So situating yourself within the context of your research project. So I'll give you an example. My research project looked at the experiences of low-income women with race and gender stereotypes at work. Part of my bracketing in that experience, in that project, was identifying that working class was my background, that the experience that I was studying, the phenomenon that I was studying, was something that I had an experience with, but also that I was engaging in specific verification methods to bring an objective and critical eye to the data. So bracketing is about situating yourself within the context of your research project. Does that make sense? Identifying those spaces where bias might be present. I had to be able to do that, to be able to bring objectivity to my research. The other thing is skills related to exposing yourself to different cultures. So researcher, know thyself is the first place to start in terms of promoting and engaging in culturally responsive research. The next step in terms of promoting culturally responsive research is also having an awareness of your participants' worldview. So in terms of attitudes and beliefs of your participants, understanding that they may be coming into your research projects or engaging in your research project with specific attitudes about research. Right? There are certain communities that are mistrustful or distrustful of research projects, especially if you're doing a research project that's funded by the government. For example, might bring a little skepticism, a little fear. Where's this research data going? How are you going to use it? Right? So understanding that your participants may have some question or uncertainty about the project and how it's going to impact them. Again, going back to the dissemination, there might be attitudes and beliefs about where's this information going to be presented? How are you going to present the results that you find? Also, cultural differences between you and the participant, right? So if you represent a particular privileged group or a group that represents power to that particular participant, understanding that power difference or that cultural difference could get in the way of the interaction and the participants' response, and even with the information that they're reporting and sharing. And then, of course, understanding that because we're all cultural beings, we come into this process, or your participants are going to be coming into this process with a worldview that reflects their values, their norms, their traditions, right? That you are walking in with your values, beliefs, and norms, and so are they. So in terms of knowledge for us as researchers, it's important for us, somebody said this back here, to understand the social and cultural and political context that your participants are existing in, right? Understanding that they are persons within the environment, and that environment and that social context, that there is this sort of interactional, bidirectional interaction in the environment. We talked about power, privilege, and oppression, understanding intersectional identity. As a Black female, I am not just a Black person and a female. I am a Black female. And that intersectional identity carries a specific experience that cannot just be found seeing me as a raced individual or a gendered individual. So understanding intersectionality, that our identities intersect or interlocking, and those intersectional identities affect how we are perceived and ultimately how we're treated. Understanding that. Understanding language and how language barriers or language differences can also impact the ways in which our participants respond to research or respond within our research projects. We understand the importance of social determinants in terms of health and illness, and making sure that we have a context for how, again, social and cultural context impacts health and illness. And of course, racism and discrimination. In terms of skills, making sure that prior to working with particular populations or samples, that we've done some homework prior to our research projects, that we are building relationships with gatekeepers and participants, and that we're keeping that relationship in the forefront and recognizing that relationship is an important process in our research project. Also making sure that we're engaging in reflective practice, that we are continuing to be open to the ways in which our bias creeps into our research projects, and engaging in reflective practices to make sure that we're bracketing our experiences and not allowing those biases to shape the research and what we ultimately report. Another skill that's for us to consider is the use of self-disclosure. When I recruited for my research project for my dissertation, part of the discussion with my participants was explaining to them that the research was part of a doctoral program, and they had questions about what that meant, and wanting to know that I experienced the thing that I was studying, and of course me trying to balance that to not affect what they shared with me, but that there was a small bit of disclosure that was necessary to facilitate that relationship. And then lastly, that as researchers, we are both bilingual and bicultural, that there is an understanding that we are speaking and communicating with our participants where they are, but also understanding that we may be representative of both cultures, culture as a researcher, and also we may be members of the cultures that we're studying, and understanding how to navigate both in a way that's objective. Is this making sense? I want to check in. I can't tell. So the occupational hazard of being a counselor is that I notice everything. So I'm making sure that y'all are still with me. So I know there's a lot on the slide. If my students were in here, they'd be shaking their head like, she tell us not to do it and she's doing it. Don't tell them I did this, okay? So in terms of promoting culturally responsive research, also the types of research designs that we use are critical. So in terms of the research problem itself, if we are researching certain populations, it's critical for us to research and engage and recruit. I'm jumping ahead of myself, but to make sure that the problem itself is salient to the participant. So when I went to recruit, for example, again, for my research project looking at low-income Black women's experiences with race and gender stereotypes at work, because these women identified that that was an experience that they had, they were open to meeting with me to share their experiences. That experience resonated with them. They wanted to talk about it, and they also looked forward to contributing to how we might address that as a counseling issue or how we might go about it in future research projects. They were interested in that topic. And so making sure that the problem is something that is salient to the participant. We also talked about understanding social and environmental context. So when we're talking about developing research questions and hypotheses, it's important to understand, again, and I don't think I have to say this to you all, but I'm going to say it again, social and environmental context matter. And particularly when you're working with certain populations, those that might be underrepresented or marginalized members of certain groups, working with gatekeepers is important. So when I went to recruit, I recruited from a federally subsidized child care program where I did my doctoral work. And what was important for me to be able to gain access to my participants is meeting with the person who coordinated that the family program. It was a parenting program that the families participated in exchange for their tuition to be covered. They had to attend weekly parenting meetings and do volunteer hours and such. And so part of my access to that population was meeting with the parent coordinator, explaining to her what I was trying to do and why it would be important and how I was going to do it and how much time was I going to take, and making sure that her families were going to be respected and not feel that their time was being intruded upon was important. She was a gatekeeper to that process, and through her I was able to recruit. The other thing is also using research frameworks such as qualitative frameworks to include the voices of those that have typically been underrepresented. So in terms of recruitment, informed consent, huge, right? It's important for participants to understand, what does this process look like? What are their rights? That's the idea that they can volunteer to terminate or not participate at any time. They need to know how the results are going to be disseminated. Recruitment is also, use of gatekeepers to promote trust is also critical. Again, if you're recruiting from specific populations that might be distrustful of research or have fears about how the research is going to be disseminated. How you communicate, respectful communication to your participants is important. The research also found the use of incentives as perhaps critical in your recruitment procedures. For my research, I gave $20 gift cards. When you're working with specific underrepresented or marginalized populations, they may not always have the luxury of free time, right? And so incentivizing their time, their research supports is a way of giving back and respecting the time and the value of that interaction. Also, in terms of recruitment, being flexible. In terms of scheduling your interviews, for me, I had to be very flexible. My participants were working class women, so they didn't always have the luxury of taking off to sit and talk with me about my little research project. It's cute that you want to graduate, but I got to work. I don't have time to play with you. So I had to meet when they could meet, where they could meet, and be respectful of that, right? But my initial bias was, you said you were interested. Well, yeah, I said I was interested, but you're going to meet when I can meet, right? I meaning them. So being flexible in how you schedule your time. The other part of recruitment is also the use of bilingual and bicultural research teams. So if you are working with the research team, making sure that you are working with a team that is linguistically competent, and also has membership or an understanding of the culture or the cultural context of the participants that you are studying. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move through. In terms of data collection and analysis, the use of specific interview protocols. Rapport building is key. So it's critical to, if you're going to be working and using this type of instrumentation, to build into your instrument an opportunity to build relationship and build connections. I talked earlier about research as instrument, gatekeepers to gain access. Member checking is a type of verification procedure where if you're using, for example, I did semi-structured interviews and transcribed them. And after I transcribed my data, I shared that data, those transcriptions, with the participants for accuracy. So they were able to verify, yes, that's what I said. Oh, I didn't get to say this, let me add that. And so having them to continue to make sure that I was presenting and capturing their voice as they shared it was critical. Is that a hand up? Yeah.
If you don't have time to answer, so I'm sure you were funded in your,
I was not.
well, I don't know if you are now, but we have sometimes you ever have issues of like where you're funded and the limitations of like the tools you can use, and you feel like some of it is biased, how do you navigate that?
You're asking the question of the type of funding, can that restrict what's being done? I'm not sure if I heard you.
How do you navigate it? So it's like we're federally funded, and I report on some of the work that we did, and some of that I felt wasn't as caught up as we wanted to be, such as gender, and it was very black and white, and now it's kind of more fluid, but you have an idea of how you navigate that with your participants, but having to fit in the context of
I think the first place to navigate is the informed consent and making sure that they understand the constraints of the funding and maybe how that's going to show up in the research project. And you and I can talk a little bit more. I want to make sure, hold that thought, and if you have time, we can process it more. But the first place that my mind goes to is informed consent and talking about the parameters of the research project. Debriefing is another process for analysis where you are maybe using a peer debriefer or someone who is conversant with the research framework that you're using to make sure that the data are trustworthy and credible. And then another type of activity is reflexive journaling. So, keeping a journal of your research process and the things that are coming up for you is another way to bring trustworthiness to the data. And then in terms of dissemination, so making sure that your results are not just going into journals, as they often do, but that their results are going to, should be accessible by participants in the communities that they live in. So technical reports, community and local publications, events. The reason why the Black Women's Wellness Conference was founded was to be able to disseminate part of what my research found, but also bring wellness in a broader context. My conference attendees, they're not reading counseling journals, but they go to conferences, right? So making sure that I was creating an event that was an extension of my research and my clinical work was a tool of dissemination. And to me, that's a sign of, or that's an example of culturally responsive dissemination. And then also dissemination should facilitate changes to the social and environmental conditions. They should lead to policy changes and improvements in clinical practice. So things for you to consider to be culturally responsive as researchers: consistently monitoring your bias and developing a positive view towards culture, understanding how your value and your bias may influence the research process and continuing to be open to those biases as they emerge, viewing research as collaborative, and seeing it as sharing power with and not power over. Viewing inclusion of cultural context to research as necessary, not ancillary, not when you get around to it, but recognizing that social and cultural contexts are critical to the research projects that we are engaging in. And then lastly, disseminating results in a way that impact the lived experiences of your participants. And that's it.